By the middle of the 19th century, the American landscape was rapidly organizing itself into a massive machine. Mass production and rigid social structures began to dictate the exact rhythm of daily life. Survival in this era demanded strict obedience to three intersecting authorities: the theological doctrine of the church, the expanding legal apparatus of the state, and the relentless economic pressure of a newly formed industrial market. Transcendentalism functioned as a radical intellectual rebellion against these specific pillars, seeking to dismantle the infrastructure of inherited belief. The core ideological mechanism of this rebellion was absolute isolation. It positioned the individual, the self, entirely outside the interconnected web of institutions. To understand how this ideological machinery actually functions, we have to audit the system by deconstructing its two primary architects. Extracting the specific survival tools built by these thinkers provides the conceptual mechanics required to navigate modern crises of systemic complicity. Ralph Waldo Emerson operated as the movement's epistemological architect. He built the theoretical framework for accessing universal truth without institutional permission. Henry David Thoreau was the operator. He took Emerson's theories and weaponized them into physical reality. This created an abstract to material pipeline, where a single unified theory of self-reliance yielded two entirely different models of human action. Philosopher Stanley Cavell provides the lens to understand this split. Cavell maps how thinking, reading, and writing act as distinct modes of possessing a self. Emerson directed this possession inward, focusing on the theoretical reform of the mind. Thoreau dragged the possession outward, forcing concrete confrontation with the state. Mapping the philosophical distance between these two figures reveals the friction points and specific boundaries of the entire transcendentalist ideology. We can systematically map their structural differences by looking at how each approached knowledge and the natural world. On the theoretical side, Emerson argued that human beings possess an intuitive capacity to grasp truth directly. No priest, no government, and no text is required to mediate the connection between the mind and reality. Consequently, he viewed the natural world primarily as a psychological mirror. The woods were useful to Emerson because they symbolized human consciousness and reflected spiritual truths. On the practitioner side, Thoreau applied radical empiricism. He counted tree rings, tracked ice thickness, and cataloged Latin plant names. Nature was reality for Thoreau, a tangible biological equal. He rejected the idea that the environment existed merely to serve human self-reflection. This empirical worldview demanded physical action. If a law or a government action proved empirically unjust, the individual had a duty to physically obstruct it, the genesis of civil disobedience. Emerson constructed the theoretical compass for self-reliance. Thoreau actually walked the hostile territory. Evaluating the macro movement reveals distinct structural triumphs, beginning with the absolute primacy of the individual conscience. By placing moral authority strictly within the individual rather than the institution, the philosophy erects a firewall against state violence and unjust legislation. When Thoreau went to jail for refusing to pay taxes that would fund the Mexican-American War and the expansion of slavery, he executed the operational test of that firewall. The movement's secondary success lies in its prescient critique of materialism and endless consumption. Decades before modern sociological data or happiness research existed, transcendentalists identified the psychological void generated by early industrial capitalism. As a diagnostic tool for isolating the diseases of blind conformity and hollow acquisition, the framework remains highly effective. However, a framework built entirely on the isolated self contains structural failures. The most visible is the Walden paradox, the reality that a radically anti-materialist philosophy easily devolves into a highly commodified aesthetic. Academic analysis in The Thoreauvian Pilgrimage documents how the site of Thoreau's cabin spawned a massive industry of recreational tourism and hagiography. This aestheticization is a symptom of the individualism problem. A system that demands withdrawal from collective institutions provides no mechanics for democratic governance or shared infrastructure. Furthermore, the model has elitism baked into its code. Thoreau's experiment required Emerson's land and significant baseline economic security, assets unavailable to the 19th century factory worker. Because the philosophy relies on subjective internal intuition, it remains vulnerable to co-optation by diametrically opposed modern political factions. An ideology that lacks the practical infrastructure to organize mass society eventually collapses into a superficial lifestyle brand. The 19th century institutional trap of the church and state has been replaced by a tighter, inescapable architecture of global supply chains and algorithmic feeds. Today, merely participating in society creates structural complicity. Consumers are permanently entangled with systems of exploited labor and environmental degradation. This is where Thoreau's tactic of civil disobedience provides the operational blueprint for modern dissent. It functions as the primary mechanism for identifying and breaking this entanglement. It poses the uncomfortable question: at what exact point does your compliance with a system make you responsible for its actions? The act of refusal functions as a mandatory moral audit of one's own limits and sacrifices. This complicity extends beyond the political and into the cognitive. The modern attention economy is explicitly engineered to fracture focus and dictate behavior, presenting a sophisticated threat to the Emersonian concept of the self. In this environment, Thoreau's call for deliberate living sheds its quaint pastoral romanticism. It becomes an active discipline to protect human attention from being harvested. Transcendentalism provides no scalable blueprint for mass societal organization. It cannot govern a nation. While it fails as a system of governance, as an emergency brake on unexamined conformity and a technology for auditing individual complicity, it remains of vital intellectual utility.